Hello. Today I want to talk about the invasions of Norway, Denmark, France, and the Low Countries in April and May of 1940. This is the second section of my summary of Alistair Parker's Second World War, Chapter 2, on the conquest of these countries. So first of all, let's talk about Denmark and Norway. In terms of the basic chronology, the German occupation of Denmark and the start of the invasion of Norway occurred on the 9th of April 1940. Resistance in southern Norway ended on the 1st of May, and the final capture by the Germans of the northern Norwegian port of Narvik was on the 9th of June. Whilst we have the map here, let me just explain the importance of Narvik. The Swedish iron ore deposits are the key element here. So Sweden had a regular export of iron ore to Germany, and in the summer this could go directly across the Baltic, but in the winter, because of ice, it couldn't, and therefore it was transshipped by rail across to the Norwegian port of Narvik and then collected there by the Germans. So capture of Narvik was a vital element in the German supply of iron ore. As I mentioned in the previous video, the British and French were already considering ways in which they could disrupt the German supplies of iron ore from Sweden, but their planning hadn't got very far. Instead, Hitler acted first with a preemptive invasion of Norway. German supply ships left German ports for Norway on the 3rd of April, and 4 fast warships followed with troops on board on the 6th. Using warships as troop transports enabled the Germans to establish themselves quickly along the Norwegian coast. The British had by this time begun to lay mines on the 8th of April, but abandoned it as soon as they realized what the Germans were doing, ordering all available ships to attack the Germans at sea. Those British troops already embarked for Norway were disembarked and didn't sail again until the 12th of April. Thus, when the Allies finally got to Norway, they had to try to dislodge German forces who had already established themselves, including in the northern iron ore port of Narvik. Although Anglo-French troops were able to recapture Narvik with great difficulty, their landing in central Norway was only temporary. That's in the area around Trondheim, as they soon began to withdraw under a German air attack. They also withdrew from Narvik after the German attack on France began. Whilst in central Norway, German air power hampered Allied troops and endangered warships, in the north, British naval superiority eventually counterbalanced the German advantage of first occupation. The Germans also had the advantage of being able to decipher a large proportion of British naval signals. The resulting German seizure of Norway safeguarded German iron ore supplies and helped in the naval war against Britain. Britain's failure in Norway also led to the fall of the Chamberlain government, which we'll talk about in the next video very briefly. As part of their Norway campaign, and really just as a footnote from the German perspective, the Germans also seized Denmark, which ensured control of the sea route to the Baltic. Unlike in the case of Norway, this was essentially only limited contestation from the Danes, so Denmark was not able to resist. The attacks on France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg began on the 10th of May 1940. That's very soon after the invasion of Norway. Within days, they had crossed the river Meuse in France on the 13th, and by the 20th of May, they had reached the English Channel. 10 days after the assault had begun, the British Dunkirk evacuations followed on the 27th of May, continuing to the 4th of June. It's useful to get a basic idea of the geography of northern France, the Low Countries, and their German neighbor. So Germany has common borders with all four countries. In the south, on the German-French border, after World War One, the French had built an enormously expensive and very effective line of fortifications referred to as the Maginot Line, which they felt would absolutely stop any German advance over their common border. So this left the Germans with options through Belgium. And in World War One, they had followed the route through northern Belgium, including towns, cities, I should say, like Liège and Namur, down through northern Belgium and then into France that way. France did not have any fortifications on its Belgian border. In between the Franco-German border, backed by the Maginot Line, and the northern easy invasion route used in World War One through Liège and the other parts of northern Belgium, there's an area of heavy forest and rough, hilly, almost mountainous countryside, which was regarded by the French as impenetrable. This is the area of the Ardennes forest, and that's the area which the Germans chose to have their main invasion route into France, and it leads into the area you'll see there, the French town of Sedan, which becomes one of the early conquests of the German invasion. So the French did not expect any attack through that area, through Luxembourg and into the extreme south of Belgium, into their countryside. You notice also on the map the river Meuse in France changes its name when it gets into Belgium, and that's a key point for the Germans in terms of getting into northern France. So this is a major turning point. The German attack on its western neighbors began on the 10th of May 1940. The events of the next 6 weeks were one of the great turning points of the war and determined its general outcome. Two major results occurred. The defeat of France made the German attack later on Russia possible, and the British decision to fight on enabled later the Americans to intervene in Europe. So this is a very crucial period in the Second World War. As I said, the French had taken the false assumption that the German attack would come through Belgium, northern Belgium, rather than the far south. Direct attack across the Franco-German border in Alsace-Lorraine was unlikely. It offered less opportunity for encircling maneuvers to secure a quick decision, but more importantly, there were formidable French fortifications behind the border, the Maginot Line, as I mentioned. And the Maginot Line was built to ensure that French mobilization could be completed before any sudden German incursion could succeed, and to economize on the forces needed to defend that part of the border so that French forces could be concentrated further north. As I said, the French were not expecting an attack across the Ardennes forest to Sedan, because that area just seemed impenetrable, especially for tanks. What should the French do about Belgium? This was a major strategic problem for the French before the outbreak of World War II. The near certainty that Germany would invade through Belgium raised both political and strategic problems for the French. In 1936, Belgium had declared neutrality, abandoning its earlier alliance with France, which had been made after World War I. The Belgian government hoped that by declaring itself neutral and firmly denying France the ability to send troops into Belgium, there would be no reason for the Germans to make a preemptive strike. This, of course, in retrospect, is very naive. The Belgian government held to this policy even after Germany had pacified Poland and could turn the full force of its armies to the west. French troops then could only enter Belgium if Belgium was invaded by Germany first. There were some secret and inconclusive military discussions between Belgians and the French and British, but these didn't lead to anything. If the Germans attacked Belgium, the French would then be faced with two options: either to abandon Belgium to its fate and defend the French frontier, or to advance into Belgium as soon as the German attack began. To abandon Belgium would enable the French to construct well-prepared positions so as to defend the French border. But it also meant that all of the resources of Belgium would be lost to the Allies. It would require defense along a much longer line, and the Germans would come dangerously close to some of the most industrialized areas in northern France. Also, by gaining the Belgian ports, the Germans would have a much stronger naval threat to British communications. But if the Allies were to advance into Belgium, how far should they go? Should most of the troops stay close to the French border, or move in force into western and central Belgium, with some even defending the mouth of the Scheldt River with possible Dutch assistance? On the 10th of May, the start of the German invasion, the more ambitious plan of moving far into Belgium was adopted. Let's talk very quickly about force size. The British, French, along with the Belgians and Dutch, had enough men and equipment to offer a successful defense. The Germans did not have an overwhelming advantage in men and equipment, unlike the situation in Poland and Norway. The Germans had 136 divisions, the French 91, the British and Belgians 10 each. Overall, the number of soldiers on the two sides was roughly comparable, but the Germans had more high-quality trained soldiers, 1 million against about 650,000 with the French and British. Also, half of the British troops were only partly trained territorial soldiers. Whilst the British infantry had supply lorries, they lacked transport lorries for their men. The two sides had comparable numbers of tanks of varying quality, but the Germans had about 1,200 heavier combat tanks available in mobile units out of a total tank force of about 2,500, whilst the French and British had only about 850. Importantly, more German armored units were organized as mobile divisions, whilst the French armor was dispersed in direct support of infantry battalions. As to aircraft, the Germans had more, over 3,000 compared to over 1,700 for the French and British with their Belgian and Dutch allies. Crucially, Germany had at least 2,000 up-to-date machines, whilst most of the available French and British planes were obsolete or obsolescent. The British actually had more planes, but they held a large part of their air force in reserve, holding back their best fighter squadrons for home defense and their main bomber force for a possible strategic attack on the German industrial region of the Ruhr. Before going into the military aspects of the French defeat, Parker considers political factors which many writers have advanced as being important in the French defeat. He emphasizes very strongly that the defeat of France in 1940 was due to superior German military tactics and organization, and not to any superiority in numbers and equipment, nor was it due to supposed political explanations offered by some writers, such as the form of the French government and the dissensions within the French democracy. First of all, the form of government. The idea that authoritarian or dictatorial regimes produce stronger armies than democratically governed societies is not supported in Parker's view, if we look at European history since the French Revolution. A society which consents to a war may fight better than one which doesn't. In the Nazi case, the government was, of course, far more aggressive than a democratic German government would have been. But in terms of civilian support, most Germans, apart from the invasion in Poland, simply wanted to end the war. In terms of internal French dissensions, did political divisions make it harder for the French to work together to defend their country? Parker thinks it's unlikely. Some right-wingers did welcome military defeat in order to end left-wing political dominance in French politics. But although the Vichy regime, which was right-wing and collaborationist after the fall of France, did act on that basis, this was a consequence of defeat and not necessarily one of its causes. The Vichy regime chose to blame the left for France's defeat. And then again, in terms of the left wing in France, left wing pacifism had already been greatly eroded in France by Nazi policies, and by March 1939, the French pacifist movement in politics was rare. Yes, the French Communist Party became hostile to the war after the Nazi-Soviet pact and supporting the Soviet Union, but that served only to weaken the Communist Party, as only the most dedicated militants continued to support the party line. So we should look at strictly military causes, according to Parker. French military production had already reached a high level by the outbreak of war. So the crucial factors for him are to do with tactics and organization. As soon as Belgium and the Netherlands were invaded on the 10th of May, they appealed for support from the French and British, and Allied troops then moved into Belgium. As the French High Command expected the main French attack to come north of Namur, in northern Belgium, in the Belgian plains, so the bulk and best of the French mobile units were sent north, also along with most of the British Expeditionary Force and the Belgians and Dutch. Their aim was to delay the German advance of what was Army Group B, which was the German army group in the north. But the Germans had by that point revised their planning. The original German plan was actually to use Army Group B in the way the Allies expected, making a western sweep along the northern flank and then moving south. This is essentially what they did with the Schlieffen Plan in World War I. Allied dispositions would, in that case, have been well placed to defend against such an attack. But under the influence of some of Germany's military leaders, including Rundstedt and his chief of staff, Manstein, German strategy had refocused on what was referred to as Army Group A. That's the one in the center, in the sector opposite the Ardennes, which now had most of the mobile and armored German divisions. The objective of this new German plan was to strike quickly for the coast and so both separate the Allied armies in Belgium from those in France and cut their supply lines. And this, of course, they succeeded in doing. The Germans achieved total surprise, both in the date and principal point of their attack. Given the delays in starting, their advance forces were in position well before the 10th of May, and a location of the heavy concentration of German armor behind them gave no indication which way they would strike. Nor were the Allies able to decipher the high-level German signals, whilst the Germans were able to decode signals from the French Ministry of War, so that they knew of Allied plans, strength, and dispositions. Thus the Germans were able to attack weak sectors of the French front. The Germans then advanced rapidly south of Namur through the Ardennes sector, and by the end of the 13th of May, their first units had crossed the Meuse River in France, quickly followed by tanks. The Germans had unexpected strength in an unexpected sector and were advancing rapidly. An effective response by the French required rapid action and redeployment of their forces, but poor French staff work and the inadequacies of higher command brought defeat. Tank units were split up to different infantry divisions. Assembly for the counterattack was delayed, as were supplies for refueling. Lack of fuel and refueling delays continued to be a problem, and some tanks got lost or broke down. There were changes in plans which separated tanks and artillery from support vehicles and other supplies. Different officers gave contradictory orders. Note: in a war between comparable forces, victory goes to the side which experiences fewer delays and confusions, and in which the chain of command is more lucid and effective. The best French troops and their equipment and morale were fully the equal of their German equivalents, but they were often not in the right place at the right time. On the 14th of May, the commander of the French forces facing the Germans at Dinant and Sedan ordered a general withdrawal to establish a defensive line further back, but his weaker static divisions collapsed, and from the 15th of May, German armored units began to break out. By the 16th of May, the German forward tanks were 35 miles beyond the Meuse crossings, and by the 18th of May, 80 miles, and by the 20th of May, they'd reached the sea, having covered 135 miles in a week. The northern French, British, and Belgian forces were now separated from the bulk of the French armies. The German rapid advance had, of course, created a corridor which was vulnerable to Allied counterattack, as the panzers and motorized infantry had dashed forward, leaving the slow-moving marching infantry with their horse transports for their supplies far behind. If the Allies had been successfully able to coordinate attacks from both north and south of the corridor, then the Germans would have been in a bad position. But there were some Allied attacks, including by an armored division commanded by Charles de Gaulle, but without infantry and artillery support, he couldn't make any gains. Again, to the north of the corridor, the British were able to worry the Germans, but not gain permanent success. The French and British had difficulties of coordination, and there was never a coordinated attack on the corridor. Then, on the evening of the 26th of May, the British Admiralty gave the order to evacuate as many troops from the British Expeditionary Force as they could from the small port of Dunkirk. This is Operation Dynamo. Would the British troops in the north be able to assemble safely and transfer to ships? They were trapped. Chances seemed slim. And on the 28th of May, Churchill opined that 50,000 men might be able to be evacuated, but many more than that would be a miracle. We'll talk about that more in the next video. So many thanks to you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without which these videos wouldn't be made. If you want to support my channel, you're very welcome to do so. Like, comment, and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give PayPal and Patreon links below if you want to provide direct support. And next week we'll talk about the British decision and the fall of France. Have a good day.